I do worry a bit that the economic forces, which are in some sense and in some domains extraordinary powers of innovation and human potential for sure, but also when dominated by a small number of actors, curtail our freedoms. And so I think we are going through a phase where we feel our individual freedoms are being limited globally. Certainly, I feel that here. And we have to reassert our liberty.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very special edition of Through Conversations podcast, where we explore the truth through conversations with the most brilliant minds. And today, in front of me is no other than David Krakauer. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Before we started recording, I was just mentioning how the world is feeling more and more complex. And it seems as though, David, your work at the Santa Fe Institute really uncovers hidden patterns in complex systems. I would love to know, getting to know you, and also for our listeners to get to know your background, your career. Where did you see the first time ever like complexity come alive in an unexpected way? How did that change your perception of, what's life really? What are we doing here on Earth, trying to make sense of it?
Oh, that's difficult. So one way to answer that is many of my colleagues in sciences or social sciences or in the arts had a moment of epiphany, a sort of blinding insight where they stood in front of a painting and overwhelmed by the beauty of it, or they looked at the night sky and saw for the first time Orion or a shooting star and so forth. I had none of that. So um, it slowly dawned on me in my teens that there was a hidden structure in the world. And I found it in novels, in films, in ideas at school. And that structure, which I was not aware of at the time, was a kind of mechanism. We would now call it, I think, retrospectively, systems of rules, systems of algorithms that rendered the world intelligible in a certain sense that's different from the way that the universe is intelligible, let's say. So right from the beginning, I didn't know then, but perhaps I know now, that my mind, was drawn to complex phenomenology, the adaptive world. And hence my interest very early in computers and algorithms and natural history and so on. And so it seems a little bit unbelievable, but actually my life has always been absorbed with complexity. I didn't know it then, and I barely know it now, but...
Hello, everyone, and thank you for allowing me to interrupt this episode. I have a huge announcement that I'll be sharing with you just now. My first book ever is out now, called The Time Is Now, a guide to honor your time on Earth. This was a 2-year project that's been in the works. It's a tough love guide to honor your time on Earth. This book will show you how to reclaim your time and energy for what truly matters. Click the link in the show notes and you're gonna see also the link to the domain here, timeisnowbook.com. Order a copy for your loved ones, and I'm so excited for you to dive into it. Thank you. Wow. And it's really interesting, that hidden structure that you mentioned. What is it specifically? When we say that hidden, something beneath us is moving the pieces of the puzzle, how should we think about that, David?
I mean, that's my whole life's pursuit, and I'm not sure I have a good answer. I know I don't have a good answer to that question. There is a novel that I always loved. I'm a big fan of the arts, and this is a novel by a writer, Robert Musil. It's called The Man Without Qualities, It was written in the 1940s. And that novel is basically about the duality between, if you like, the conscious or mystical experience of the human in the context of the larger distributed machine of society or the natural world. And this duality between individual agency in the face of overwhelming collective constraint and the forms that that enables, it's that that I'm interested in. That is the latent structure. And of course, if you pursue ideas in society or mythology or mathematics, you somehow engage with those in very different ways. You take different sections through this hyper object. But it's something like that.
That's really deep. I need to take a moment because there is this sense of agency in life, right? But I also keep thinking that, and after listening to you, it's just we're also being driven by a current that we don't really have any control of, be it, like you say, natural forces or societal forces that drive us towards something. And so that duality, that in itself, would you say that constrains us on our sense of agency to unleash who we are, or that unleashes our abilities to really become our best versions? Because it seems as though we cannot be whatever we want given the natural laws of physics, but at the same time there seems to be natural laws of society in a way that exist in thousand years in the making before I even was born.
Yeah, I think, when I was younger, I used to surf and not very well. And as you know, when you begin, you're overwhelmed by the power of the wave. So the current, quite literally, defeats you. And slowly you develop skill and expertise, and you learn how to use the force of the wave to your advantage. And I think that is accurate. I feel as if we go through periods of non-familiarity where those currents and forces are overwhelming, and then periods where we somehow develop the appropriate skills to harness that power. And I think that's true in the world of ideas. I mean, think about it. When you first learnt a difficult concept in philosophy or mathematics, it was like a wave. It's like, what is this? As you said, this thing has existed long before me and it will outlive me. And I'm not sure I can handle it. And it's a bit overwhelming, but you develop the skills, right? And you start to harness its power. And I think in a way, this is the sort of Tai Chi of complexity, right? An appreciation of the power of ideas or forces that are not of your own invention, that you make a tiny, tiny, tiny contribution to, and learning how to harness them, hopefully for good, to further the wave or to contribute important ideas. And it's interesting that this kind of dialogue sounds very abstract, I think, but I think it captures, to be honest, at least for me, some essence of what it means to be a free agent in a highly connected world.
It's yeah, I do see it as abstract, but also the agency in life. It's been a theme that I've been thinking of, and also through reading your work and how small iterations and how evolution changes and become bigger and bigger, complex systems. It seems as though we're facing at this stage of the 21st century one of the biggest shocks, or it's been discussed as one of the potentially biggest shocks for how we are going to move as a society with AI and with technology. And so having that as the undercurrent, let's put it that way, how does the sense of agency on an individual scale become affected? Do you see it as, right before we were about to record, I mentioned that maybe automation will allow for different senses of meaning of what it means to be alive, rather than just working all the time. Maybe exploring more creative outputs. But I would love to hear on your insights on, how the clash of technology, but at the same time, the rise of humanity as well. Maybe more psychologists, more, we're gonna see more Vincent Van Goghs emerge. Hopefully,
Mhm.
they don't outsource art. But I would love to get your insights into this dissonance between, being able to do everything with AI, just a matter of a click, but also leveraging our creativity.
Yeah, I mean, this is the ancient, timeless debate about the role of technology in our lives. Back to Plato and the Phaedrus, through Bergson and his conception of Homo sapiens as Homo faber, man the maker of tools, tools that amplify our dispositions and capabilities, and then the response, of course, of the Luddites in the Industrial Revolution to the threat of the loss of wage labor, and so it's timeless. And my sense is it goes back to my earlier metaphor of the wave, because there's almost a cyclicity to this response. A first excitement and a utopian, fantastical optimism, very quickly subdued by a reality check. And then eventually a maturation of our capabilities in terms of how we use them. And, anytime a new material is introduced into a sport, everyone objects. You go from catgut to nylon in a tennis racket, and this is the end of the world. And a new baseball bat that somehow is eliminating human capability, and so forth. I think we are at exactly that moment with respect to algorithms and AI, where we're at that cusp between pessimism and excessive optimism. And we will, in the next decade, as we always do, adapt and come to understand its strengths and weaknesses. What sequence models cannot do and will never do, and things that they will always do well and do better than us. I mean, in the way that our automobiles move more quickly than us. This is not an issue. So I have a slightly longer, what we would say in a mathematical sense, time constant. And I think the tendency of the current moment, perhaps that is different because of the density of connectivity of the world, to accelerate our reflexes and not be as thoughtful as we should be. And, you just remember, less than a decade ago, I couldn't have a conversation with someone that wasn't about blockchain. There was nothing else in the world. It sucked up all the oxygen. And now no one talks about it. And it's not because it's not important. It's simply because it's normalizing. It's becoming something more natural for us. And I think exactly the same thing will happen now. And so I find both the cynics who think it's irrelevant, the alarmists who think it'll destroy us, the optimists who think it'll make us live in a utopia, all of them are sort of a foolish, ahistorical perspective on what is a universal experience of humans.
Wow. Yeah, and as part of Gen Z, I've been witnessing how a lot of my fellow peers in my generation have dealt with, not understanding the cycle that you mentioned, and how a lot of uncertainty, not only for my generation but everywhere, how quote unquote all jobs are gonna be in jeopardy, all jobs are gonna be replaced. And so, I would love to hear also for our listeners who are around like 25, 44 years old. That's like kind of like the range. So shout out to all of you listening now. It's how, what ideas, what pillars, what first principles should we anchor ourselves to when we're dealing with this pivotal moment, quote unquote, this in between that you mentioned, David, of, this will all go to boom or this will all go to bust. How can I harness my own power and my and ground myself into understanding how these cycles behave.
I mean, again, I don't have any panaceas. I I'm an advocate of thoughtfulness and reflection and removing oneself for periods of time from the fray. It's very difficult to think in the face of this kind of intense illumination, right? Um, I let me just put it a little bit in historical perspective because it might help. Um, someone I greatly admired when I was at Oxford was the humanist philosopher Isaiah Berlin. And I would attend his seminars at All Souls College. And he was very interesting in the contrast between Voltaire, who was, as you probably know, a champion of Newton, with the mathematician Emily de Châtelet. They wrote a book on the Principia, and believed that the Newtonian style of reasoning should permeate all of society, and that became one of the important threads running through the Enlightenment. In contrast to Voltaire was Vico, the Neapolitan Italian theorist of history, who didn't see history as being progressive, who didn't see history as being scientific, but viewed it as cyclical, and thought that there were phases when we were more mythical, theological, and there were phases where we tended towards being more enamored of reason, and these would cycle. And I have to say, I think of the current moment as paradoxically religious. It has a kind of theistic, metaphysical character built on top of a scientific, technological foundation. And the dialogues that we're having now are very millenarian. The end of the world by virtue of being dominated by an AI out of our control. This is entirely Miltonic, right? This is not a scientific debate. And so one way to think about it is we're actually going through a very religious moment in a society that's so bereft of a common shared belief that we found it in a technology. And I think we found it in technology in the Industrial Revolution. And we'll just have to come to terms with that cyclicity and approach this problem with greater reason, which requires reflection and more thoughtfulness, removing ourselves a little bit from the news cycle, which is basically an advertising medium as opposed to a medium of truth.
And I'm excited to also announce that I'm going to open through conversations to a members exclusive section only, where you'll be able to access episodes earlier. I'm going to create so many perks for you that I'm excited for. I wanted to get the best value possible, and I've been thinking on how to do it. I want to give you access to early videos. I want to give you also access to, when I record an interview, that you have access real time to just watch while we record, and also to have a live stream, meaning that you can tune in and ask your own questions, your Q&A to some of your favorite guests, and also some of the guests that you don't really know yet, but you would love to hear. And also that way you have some sort of skin in the game as you're supporting the podcast in some way, and you're more invested in the success of it. And so I'm excited for this. Wow. I've hosted Professor John Vervaeke. He's a psychologist from the University of Toronto, and he always, when he comes to the show, he mentions that we're dealing with a meaning crisis. That the 21st century is like as if we were just walking zombies, trying to find meaning in everything. And now that I listen to you say, the religiosity of the technological movements that we're dealing with, do you see it as a grasp for us trying to get back that meaning in our lives for whatever reason, just even if that meaning comes from being doomer in the sense that AI will conquer our lives? Do you see younger generations and just society as a whole just trying to grasp for whatever huge movement, social movement, whatever movement, to get back to that, that part of our lives that's, that really seeks meaning?
That's interesting. I don't know enough about this. I doubt I have a slightly less pessimistic, I think, view. I'm interested in history. I read books written over the centuries, and they seem very familiar to me. I mean, I read Homer, and it's like, yes, I understand. And I read Rabelais, and I say, yes, I understand. So I don't feel out of time. And so I think humans have always searched for meaning. I don't think that's a new experience. And I think we've always been faddish and overly enthusiastic about glossy new things. Um, we had it for tulips, and that's amazing. Now we have it for AI, which is arguably more impressive. So I'm slightly less cynical about that.
Mhm.
Um, I do think that our, and this is what I work on, of course, I'm interested in the evolution of intelligence and what it seeks. And it is true that intelligent systems seek to minimize energy expenditure. And that's why we use calculators. That's why we drive cars. We're not in minimizing energy expenditure in the planet, far from it, but for ourselves. And to the extent that an intelligent system will minimize the amount of cognitive work we have to perform, we will pursue it with alacrity. And it is also true that historically we haven't had access to such mind-like machines as we do now. And so the character of this moment is different. So, in the Industrial Revolution, it would have been steam engines as opposed to manual labor. And now it's algorithms as opposed to mental labor. And given that we place so much store in the unique characteristics of our species as intellectual, then it takes on a new character that I think the philosophers have to reckon with. And I would accept that as new. But I do not accept that we're zombies. I think that people are deeply thoughtful when given the chance. And we are wrestling with the real moment. It's not an artificial construct.
You mentioned energy expenditure, and you know, rehearsing in my mind this interview with you, David, I was thinking on, you know, connecting evolution and entropy, that sort of ideas with AI, of course. And of course, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Um, do you think that's really this? It's sort of like when I listen to you, it says it's we're like unconsciously driving ourselves to reduce the entropy, to try to really reduce the energy that we're uh, expending. So, do you see the whole movement of us trying to transfer our consciousness into these AI systems? Once they become robots, do you see that as the unconscious desire for us to just reduce energy? Do you see that as the next leap in human evolution?
Well, so let me explain a little bit about intelligence and energy and entropy.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, now, intelligent systems, and I've made this point many times. I don't consider AI intelligent at all, and I should explain why. I consider them very capable and very useful. Uh, just they're not intelligent. Um, Intelligence is discovering by some means, whether you're an athlete, an artisan, you know, researcher, an elegant means of solving a problem. When you start playing a sport, you expend a huge amount of energy to underperform. As you get better, you learn how to minimize your expenditure of energy to do well. So if you go and watch a football game or whatever your favorite sport is, the difference in a good player and a bad player is very obvious. The good player expends very little effort, or seems to do an extraordinary thing. And that is the characteristic of intelligence in every system. So a brilliant mathematician doesn't work as hard as a bad one. This is why AI is not intelligent, because intelligence means elegance, minimality, efficiency, a minimal expenditure of effort to accomplish a goal. And this has been known forever and ever and ever in poetry and physics. And an AI is a huge monster of an energy suck to accomplish what would be admittedly an extraordinary capability. And again, I don't want to minimize the capability. And so what happened in the history of life is, as we created machines, we discovered very capable means of solving problems very inefficiently. That's what an airplane is. That's what a car is. That's what an AI is. And it stands in contrast to us. As my colleague Jeffrey West says, we're light bulbs. We run on 100 watts. You couldn't be more efficient, right, than life. And so in that sense, the AI revolution is a continuation of the highly inefficient means of attaining high capability. Now, that is not sustainable. And so the reason it matters is, given the finite resources of the Earth, their very unequal distribution, the enormous unfairness of life as we experience it, we need to reflect now on that divergence between these two kinds of machines, the one that evolution made and the ones that we engineered. And I don't think there's been enough thought about that, to be honest, because these debates tend to get segregated into departments. Political scientists weigh in on it, or economists weigh in it, or and I feel that we need, and this is why complexity matters to me at least, we need a fairly thoughtful way of integrating all of those perspectives on the divergence between the evolved and the engineered world. And I think that there isn't much of a forum for that at the moment, unfortunately.
Why do you think that is? Why haven't we been able to, come into, for example, because I know that on Santa Fe Institute there is not really departments in that sense.
Yeah.
So how have you been able to connect?
Well, we've bited, right? It's quite interesting. I mentioned earlier Bergson's Homo faber. It's funny because I have a colleague and I have just written a book. This book is called The Book of Triangles, and it'll be published by MIT in 2026. And it's on goodness, beauty, and truth, or ethics, evidence, and aesthetics. And if you look back at history, these are often called the three transcendentals. Plato talks about them, Aristotle talks about them, Simone Weil talks about them, Charles Peirce talks about them, Kierkegaard talks about them. They're there everywhere, right? And when our species was named, Linnaeus gave us the name Homo sapiens, wise humans. And as I referred to earlier, Bergson came along and said, we're not wise, we're tool makers. Another extraordinary thinker, Huizinga, said, we're not tool makers, we're simulators. We like to simulate alternative rule systems. Homo ludens, human players, the game maker. Rousseau comes along and says, no, we're not wise. We don't play games. We don't make tools. We're about an ethics. Our species is uniquely moral. Now, of course. And what happened here is that the aspiration to wisdom was put in a giant particle collider and fragmented into the three vertices of a triangle, which manifested in our institutions. So now you go to an economics department or a sociology department or a math department or a physics department. Where is the department that says these things are connected in our minds, in our world? And so SFI is an attempt in one way, and I'm sure there are many ways of doing this, to return to Homo sapiens, wise humans, which is the conjunction of beauty, goodness, and truth. A dialogue between the arts and the sciences, as opposed to a separation. And I think what's happened, to be honest, is that the institutional forms and the economic incentives are so perverse that it's very difficult to move back into a more classical state where the three live together in a somewhat more harmonious way. But I think it's absolutely essential. And SFI is a tiny little speck of an outpost. It's Asimov's, foundation on a distant planet, trying very hard to think about the world in a slightly more integrated way.
David, you hinted with your upcoming book, which, of course, eager to read it and to share it with our listeners. You hinted at, and correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps, I want to discuss, you mentioned a lot of philosophers there, so I would love also to have that conversation. But before that, I would love your own philosophy of life. Do you feel that humans are Homo sapiens? Are we a wise species? That's our motto. Are we creative engines? What do you think is really our true nature as a species?
I'm not sure we have a true nature. I think that might be our true nature. And I'm not being paradoxical. I was always very interested in Marvin Minsky's idea of the society of mind, that mind is somehow like a zoo, and it's made of many functions, and each of those functions operate in different domains. And that idea was taken on quite recently, actually, by a number of very thoughtful cognitive anthropologists, Messier, Sperber, Cecilia Hayes. And their idea is to take Minsky's conception of a society of the mind and explode it into the society of culture. So culture is a kind of vast system of distributed algorithms that we partake in, we sample from. That's what pedagogy is when done well. And by virtue of the finite set of algorithms that each of us contains, we are better or worse at solving certain problems in different domains. Our nature reflects that sample. And that sample, by the way, includes moral principles, which are not fixed. And so I do think it's fair to say that human intelligence is the capability to acquire capabilities, and that in some sense distinguishes us from the rest of the animal world. Not entirely, because of course other animals have culture, but not to this degree.
And in terms of, going now into the macro, into the undercurrent, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this question that just popped up. Are you seeing any trend towards, like, maybe this is a very big question, a very broad question, culturally, it may vary, but do you see any trend in terms of overarching life philosophy that's driving society today?
Ooh. We started this conversation as this kind of tension between individual freedom and societal constraints. And I do worry a bit that the economic forces, which are in some sense and in some domains extraordinary powers of innovation and human potential, for sure, but also when dominated by a small number of actors, curtail our freedoms. And so I think we are going through a phase where we feel our individual freedoms are being limited globally. Certainly, I feel that here. And we have to reassert our liberty. And that's a collective action problem.
Mm-hmm.
So on the positive side, now is a time for an entirely radically new metaphysics, right? It's not as if, our ideas ran out with the Buddha, or with Jesus, or with Newton, or Darwin, or Madame Curie, or whoever you admire most, I feel the world is in need of an entirely new system of thought to make sense of the current moment. And I suspect, the success of, Graeber and Wingrove's book in some sense, which was a kind of application of traditional anthropological thought to our modern economic circumstance, the hunger for that book, with its strengths and its weaknesses, was evidence of what I'm talking about, which is we need new ideas now. And I think that's an extraordinary moment, actually. I think that's brilliant, that you talk about Gen Z. Okay, let's do this. Let's do this. Let's think about a new course which doesn't deny the enormous advantages of technology. We're not going to return to a sort of Neolithic age. That seems rather unrealistic unless things go horribly wrong. But before things go horribly wrong, let's really think about new systems of governance and collaboration, new kinds of thoughts, knowledge systems. I mean, I'm very excited, actually. And every day I come to work at SFI and I hear something new, not always, revolutionary, but that the appetite for novelty is very great, and human capability has been demonstrated to be extraordinary. So, we're living in a moment that wants us to be cynical and despair, but exactly at that moment, right, you do something extraordinary. So I know that sounds a little silly, but I want to believe that.
Yeah, it's I would love to expand a bit more on this, on the future of our governance systems, our economic systems, and understanding the shadow itself that you mentioned previously, which was, it might be right now steering into a very unequal and very unfair system that is, not allowing for everyone to tap into their own potential and just live meaningful lives. How do these systems look like, and how do you see the how can we, like, really, on the collective action issue, how can we really push those forward? How do you see on governance, us migrating towards a more, to more of your vision on how they should look like?
So yeah, so again, I mean, I need to confess that I'm a tiny atom of a scientist, and
But
the
with
question you're
great
asking,
ideas.
well, with a few ideas, and I think, and the questions you're asking are huge. Um, and let me make it more modest and explore a little bit the Santa Fe Institute as a microcosm.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we came into existence in the 1980s. In fact, I'll just tell you a little bit of the story. The founding president of the Institute, George Cowan, and I will get to the question, I'm not trying to skip it. In 1956, he had worked with Enrico Fermi and Eugene Wigner, both Nobel Prize winners in physics. He was a child prodigy. Went to a meeting in Aspen, actually, and he tried to convince the audience, largely of diplomats and natural scientists, social scientists and humanists, of the value of the idea of entropy, that the idea of social entropy might prove to be important, right? Social disorder and so on. Borrowing ideas from Carnot and Boltzmann and Clausius and Gibbs and others. And he was met with resounding silence. Years pass, and this is nagging him. And he begins the process that will lead to the creation of the Santa Fe Institute. He realized at that point that this problem of division, of mutual incomprehensibility, had to be built into the structure of the organization at day one. And so, in our founding meeting at the end of 1984, which is a kind of important year from the Orwellian point of view, um, that we would have represented all of these parties in the room: the humanists, the social scientists, the mathematicians, the computer scientists, the physicists, the biologists, the archaeologists, and we would discuss together the underlying patterns in the systems of the world. So what we started with, in a sense, hence my interest in this place. And out of that organically came a distributed network of researchers that do not resemble in any way a university department or a university. It's a very decentralized network of scholars from very, very diverse areas, searching for common patterns and common principles, principles of information, and so on, and complexity science, I guess. And that has grown very slowly, but is a model of what Eleanor Ostrom much later called polycentrism. She was thinking about it, of course, in terms of local communities, in a political economy context. We were thinking about it in a scholarly context. And I do believe that there is a structural insight to be had from studying models like this. And I'll say that they very much depend on an alignment of interests and a plurality on day one. Because if you get that wrong, the error locks itself in, and the incentives become perverse. So I'm very keen on these models where you put all your utopian sentiments right at the beginning, and there's a kind of pragmatic impulse to say, we can't discuss all of that now. Let's be more practical about it. And I think that's a mistake. I think the value in culture is primary and the mechanics secondary. And if you get that sequence out of order, my own view is that things don't work as well.
Well, it's a tough challenge for sure. Now that the undercurrent of those systems is alive and perhaps steering into not the most ideal scenario, but at the same time, they are revealing the places that we can improve on, and your vision does allow us to just reflect on how can we integrate those into not only our systems, but I think that my last question here, I know I'm working on time, David, is on an individual scale, harnessing those principles. And it's, correct me if I'm wrong, but perhaps your answer here was sort of like trying to harness the power of orderly chaos, like sort of like this decentralized chaotic dance, but at the same time has its own rhythm. Naturally, you could say. On an individual scale, can we achieve that? Can we achieve tapping into that life, which is chaos, so we can, make order out of it in a way?
Yeah. As you know, the mission of the Santa Fe Institute is searching for order in the complexity of evolving worlds. So, yes. So, isn't that what great music is? Isn't that what great dance is? Isn't that what great sport is? Or great thought? It's, I think you're completely correct. Interestingly, just quickly on complexity science, in 1948, Warren Weaver provided a definition of complexity. And he said, on the one hand, you have simplicity, physics, classical physics. On the other hand, you have disordered complexity, like a gas, completely chaotic. And in the middle, you have organized complexity that balances order and disorder, randomness and regularity. And that zone of interest is very difficult for us to understand. It means living in high uncertainty, but finding local patterns, local eddies that we can, in some sense, use. And if there was one larger epistemological request I would have, is for people to loosen up a little bit and be prepared to live in a higher state of uncertainty. It's okay. Because like the wave, that thing has a lot of power And if you develop the right skills, you get to ride it. And so I always feel uncomfortable with people who are either completely straight laced, who want to control everything, the sort of actuarial engineering mindset, or completely chaotic, which is a certain, Dionysian attraction, but difficult to work with. And so this kind of sweet spot, which is difficult to balance on, but which is sort of the essence of the creative space in every domain. And so there is a kind of existential, epistemological implication. And so fill your mind with diverse opinions.
David, what a great time. It flew by. I'm sure that we can discuss this for hours, not only on complexity, but also life. But I'm also excited for our listeners to get to know you, and hopefully you get to come back to the show and share more on your insights, because it was truly a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks to your listeners for listening, if you did. Okay.
Thank you, David. Take care.
Thank you. Ciao.